Hello, welcome. I see there's a couple people here. That's awesome. So today, as you may be aware, we're going to work on the wing feathers of this pine warbler. So if you saw my event notice, there is a photo reference attached to that if you're new to these classes. And I would definitely recommend, watching the other classes before this one if you can. But also, if you're just tuning in to learn a little more about drawing and you're not necessarily drawing along, that's fine too. It's really useful, for any bird artist to watch and observe how to draw wing feathers. So I have the different feather groups already sketched out on this little guy here. So we're going to start out with the coverts. I have the median coverts right here sketched out, and then the greater or the secondary coverts right there. This is actually just one feather known as the alula, which is it's a really cool adaptation that birds have. When they're coming in for a landing, it helps them to have a smooth landing if they just kind of lift that feather up a little bit. But it's a pretty prominent feather, so that's a good one to add in. And then I have the primary coverts here. So the primary coverts and the secondary coverts, basically you can think of those as covering the primaries, this group, and then the secondary coverts cover the secondaries here. So if the bird's wing was stretched out, I'll actually show you on an extra piece of paper here. This is by no means going to be a good drawing, but basically you would have these are the primary coverts. These are the primaries. Secondary coverts there, and then secondaries here. And then you have like some of the lesser coverts, and here's the median coverts right here. Hope you could see that, yeah. So I have that all sketched out in graphite. You can also see the other wing a little bit over the top of his back, overlapping. So we'll talk a little bit about how to sketch that in as well. But the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start adding colored pencil. So I'm going to erase this line here for the median coverts, and we're going to start working on that because I don't want to have graphite coming in, but I'm not going to erase it all the way, just so I can barely see it. So to you it might look gone, but to me I can barely see it there. And the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to be using a lot of different grays for this particular class. So I would recommend, if you have a range of different kinds of grays in your colored pencils, I would recommend taking all of those out just so you have them on hand. And then if you're just using regular graphite pencil instead of colored pencil, that's fine too. Basically, when I come in with the light colors, I'm mostly going to be using a lot of warm grays. So for example, when I come in with a warm gray 2 or something like that, you're just going to use lighter pressure with your graphite pencil. And then when I do the darker, like the inner part of the feathers, then you'll use a little more pressure. So I'm just going to outline each of those feathers, because unlike the belly feathers and the cheek and all this in the back, these feathers are a lot more organized. They're not as loose and fluffy, so we are going to actually define the edge of each one. Well, I say that, but the edges of the feathers are also kind of fluffy, especially for the coverts. You'll see that if you have your reference photo out. But yeah, if you don't have access to the photo while you're watching me, that's totally fine because you can just watch what I'm doing too. So what I like to do is I'm looking at my reference photo and I like to count the feathers. So I'm going to count in that first group. It's about 6, oh, maybe 7 that you can see there. And they're overlapping. So I also like to look at how they're overlapping and the shape of each one of the feathers as well. I usually start from this side, but you can also start from this side, you know, whatever feels the most natural to you. And I'm going to use a very light gray. Just, you know, dark enough so that I can see it. And that's going to define the edges of my feathers. Let me just see if this shows up on the screen, though. It looks like it is. I'm going to use one that's a little darker just so you guys can see me. Let's see. I'm going to go with warm gray 5 with light pressure just so you can see me. But I would recommend using one a little bit lighter than that. So I've got these first 2 feathers that are closest to the back. This one is kind of coming underneath of the next one. And you know, if you are looking at the reference photo, it's good to always pay very close attention to the shape. These feathers have pretty rounded tips on them. So they're not going to be nearly as pointy as the primaries, like some of the more outer flight feathers. So I'm making pretty textured edges to these feathers. And like a blunt, rounded end on them. So I always like to sketch them out first because, you know, I counted them and I counted 7. So if I accidentally, you know, mess up with my guesstimation as I put these in, it's not too difficult to just erase. And that's also why I like to use a light color. Because if you go too dark with your pressure, you're not going to be able to erase it, if you're using colored pencil especially. So I've got 4 there, and then I have one. It's a pretty prominent looking one here. And it looks like this is an interesting overlapping pattern. I've got one here, and one that you can kind of barely see that's coming underneath of it like that. So there may actually be more feathers in this set than you can actually see, but they might be being covered up by some of the back feathers so they're not visible. There probably is more, you know, there's probably actually 10 there, but... And then above that, you can also see some kind of grayish, fluffy looking feathers. I'm going to add those in too. They're just barely coming out from underneath of the lesser coverts. So that's just the border of them. All right. And you'll notice, if you're looking at the photo, the other interesting thing about these feathers is that the pine warbler has a wing bar, which means there's a white line. So the last thing I'm going to do before I start adding more detail is just sketch in where that line is. So I'm going to do the same thing, make it kind of textury. But think about the direction of the barb growth too. So when I say that, why don't I do another little, basically cartoon inset drawing. So one feather, you know, looks like this, but then it's got this middle part, the shaft here, and it's got barbs coming off the sides. So like when I'm doing a wing bar, I want to think about the direction of those barbs. So on this side, they're kind of going to be going, you know, like that way. And on that side, that way. And you might be looking at this saying like, whoa, that's a very subtle thing. But it is important to always follow the direction of, you know, if you're drawing a bird, of the barb growth, or if you're drawing like a mammal, of the hair growth. Because if you don't follow that the whole time, even when you're doing your base layer and outlines and stuff, it's going to end up kind of making your drawing not quite look right. So the other thing you can do is, you know, if you're looking at your photo, you can see, let me zoom this in a bit. You can see the shaft of the feather right there. So you can also add that in on the feathers where you can see it. I hope this is all making sense, and feel free, of course, at any time to type questions into the comments. So when you get to this one, you know, the wing bar is kind of coming up a little here. And if you want to get really particular, you can even measure on your reference photo and on your picture how big each of these is, which I'll be honest with you, I do actually do that sometimes, but you don't have to get quite as particular as that. So I guesstimated this time, and I got the 7 feathers in there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then there's this little tiny one here. Alright, so now I'm going to start with a base layer. And I'm going to do the upper part of the feather first. And I'm just going to do maybe 2 of these. Because what I want to do for this lesson is just show you how to draw like a couple of feathers from each of the groups, so that after this you can go on and continue and draw the rest of your feathers. Because if I showed you, you know, for the whole entire wing, that would take a while. But please feel free to ask questions. Alright, so I'm looking at the gray here. So sometimes people wonder, you know, how do I tell if it's warm gray or cool gray? For most kinds of pencils, you're going to have, you know, whether it's Prismacolors or these polychromos ones that I'm using, you're going to have both warm grays and cool grays. And they'll come in either percentages or numbers. So the higher the number, the higher the percentage, the darker the color is going to be. So a warm gray means that it's like a very yellowy kind of gray. Compared to a cool gray, which is going to be more like blue. Let me show you a bit of a comparison for that. So here's a cold gray 5. Hopefully you can see that, versus a warm gray 5. And I'm sorry if the lighting is a little bit funky for that. But the bottom line is that this is more yellowy and this is more blue. So on this bird's wing, he's got kind of like a brownish tinge to his wing. So I'm going to be using a lot more warm grays, but you can also mix the two together too. So what I'm looking at is when you look at those feathers, the edges of them, when you look at the darker part of the feathers, which is at the top, the edges are like a fairly light gray. So I'm going to use, let's see, but it's not that light, I mean, honestly. I'm going to use a warm gray 5, but I'm going to use, you know, not very dark pressure, kind of medium pressure. And I'm going to go in the direction of the barbs. And you can go, you know, a little bit back and forth because this is your base layer, so the texture isn't going to be necessarily perfect. You're just blocking in that first bit of color. Let's do 3 since these are kind of small feathers. Oh, and the other ones, I kind of forgot about the ones above that. So those little feathers that are kind of peeking above that are going to be a lighter gray. I'm going to use warm gray 3 for those. Those are pretty fluffy looking feathers. All right, and the next thing I like to do, once I put a base layer down, is smooth it out. So a good pencil for doing that is Warm Gray 2. But any pencil that's lighter than this layer that you put down will basically work, you know, whether it's gray or whether it's white. Another good one is this Luminance White is really good for smoothing things out. And also for burnishing, which is when you kind of use a stronger pressure to get it really, really smooth. And make sure you don't have white spots on your paper. But for this, I'm just going to use the Warm Gray 2. And I kind of do like a back and forth motion for this. Again, going in the direction of the barbs. And my goal here is to just make it so there aren't white spots on the paper. Alright, now it's time to come in with a darker color. I'm actually going to use, once you get to that darker part, it definitely does get to kind of a cooler gray. So I'm going to use Cold Gray. Let's see if I can find it. Cold Gray 6, which is the darkest one. And then after that, I'm probably going to come in with just a little bit of black because it gets quite dark in spots. So I like my pencil to be pretty sharp for this part. If you're using a smooth paper like this bristle board here, you'll want your pencils to be pretty sharp all the time. And I like to start at the part of the feather that is like being overlapped by the next one, if that makes sense, and then work my way out. And now I am using very textury kind of strokes, so just lines as if they're feather barbs. You can also go along the edge. You'll really want it to be sharp for this part. And just get that sort of fluffy edge in there. And then for this one, you can see that there is the central part of the feather here, the shaft. And then you go, you work in this direction. You've got an edge overlapping here. Then you go in that direction. But when you get to this edge part, you don't want to go quite all the way to that edge. You want to leave a little line because that is the light area that will show the delineation between the two feathers there. And you do want a little bit of texture to show that fluffiness there. One more. I'll also do the ones up above too. So the ones up above are really quite fluffy. You can see I added in, these pretty dark lines in between some of the barbs there that are shadows. Alright, and lastly, I'm going to add in some black. So here's my Polychromos black. I have it in a pencil extender because it is almost gone. Make sure it's nice and sharp. And that is a really nice tool to have, this extender for your pencils, so that you use the entire pencil and you don't waste any of it. So this black is going to be just in the darkest areas. So it's going to be like in between the borders, you know, in between these feathers, like right here. And then, you know, on this edge of the feather shaft here is going to be darker. And then right in here. A little bit there too. Oh, and then I meant to put a little more darkness up here too. With that cold gray. So always be thinking about how the feathers are overlapping each other and try to show, you know, think of it as 3D. So like this one's over the top of that one's over the top of this one. So you really want to have a nice contrast between your light areas and your shadowy areas. You can also use, you know, a little bit of lighter pressure of the black as you get further out towards the edge of the feather. And if you want to have a little bit more smoothness, which I would recommend, between the outside edge of the feather and the inside edge, you know, where the light and the dark part meet, you can also take like a warm gray 2 or a warm gray 3 or, you know, anything lighter. And do a little bit of harder pressure back and forth and blend it. Okay, so let's do the ends of the feathers too. So even though they look white, you know, they're not going to be completely and entirely white. So you can see, especially on this one here, oh, and I need to mark this in a bit better. There we go. That there is a little bit of shadow. Let's get a darker warm gray. I'll use a warm gray 5. But just with light pressure. Put that shadow right there. You can add, you know, at the fringy edge part, a little bit of shadow there too. Up this contrast a little bit more. The nice thing about these feathers is they are pretty organized, and you know, I'm not going to be kind of switching between colors quite as much. I realize, you know, when I'm teaching this area, I've got to be careful because normally when I draw something, I kind of just switch between colors in a random way sometimes, but I want to make sure everything's clear. I mean, everything has a step-by-step process to an extent. But yeah, those are just, you know, 3 of those median coverts here. So since we've got all the outlines blocked in, let's move on to these greater coverts, or the secondary coverts, which are going to be a bit longer of feathers. So again, I'm going to erase this graphite outline until I can barely see it. Brush off the eraser crumbs a little bit. And then, like I did for these coverts, I'm going to just draw the outline of every single one. And the first thing I'm going to do is count them. So we've got 1, 2, 3. I can see 9 there. There's probably 10, but one of them is maybe covered up by some of the back feathers. And again, I'm going to use a pretty light gray that's nice and sharp to do the edges. So something like maybe a warm gray 3. I think you'll be able to see this. Let me just try to do the edge of one and see how it looks on my screen. And do let me know in the comments if for some reason you can't see it. Oh yeah, that should be good, I think. So again, these feathers have a pretty rounded end here. They're much longer, obviously, than the other coverts that we just did. But think about that shape, you know, it's got like a U shape to it. And all these feathers have a pretty similar shape, except, you know, also look at the shape of the entire feather group, which is why you do want to barely be able to see this line, just to help guide you as you go. And think about, too, you know, what this trailing edge looks like. You've got a little bit of bumps between the feathers here. So like that. And they appear to get, you know, shorter as you go, which some of that is just because they're being overlapped by the feathers above them. And then as you go this way, the feathers kind of, it looks almost like they blend into each other, if that makes sense. Like the one overlapping it overlaps it more. So you really just get this line that goes into there, and you don't see that U shape because it's covered up by the next feather. So I've got 4 there. And also, they start to get a little bit less fluffy at the edges as you go, too. Perfect. All right. So next, again, you can see that there is a second wing bar here. So we can sketch in where the end of that is. So it's basically going to be, you know, on some of the inner ones, it's a little bit less obvious. It's a little brownish, you know, at the tip of that feather there. So you've got that little sort of U shape. So just look at the border of the darkest area on each one. And you can really only see the feather shaft on 3 of them. Once you get past that, it's just covered up. And then, you know, this is pretty nice and easy because the line is pretty much a straight line as you go along here. So it's kind of neat when you're drawing birds, you know, if you're a birder and you've heard the term wing bar before. The wing bar, typically, you know, when birds have 2 wing bars, it really means the tips of these covert feathers are white or lighter in color. Alright, and the next thing I'm going to do is, again, we'll start at the top part, you know, the darker part of the feathers, and then we'll do the lighter part. And I am going to do more feathers for this one. Let's do like 5. So 1, 2, 3. Yeah, so you can just see the technique for these outer ones and for these. Because, you know, these ones here, you'll notice a color difference if you're looking at the reference photo. That the tip of the feather here has a lot more brown in it here. And as you move along the wing bar, the tips of the feathers get lighter and like more of a brighter white. So again, we will use, let's see, I'm going to use a warm gray 5 and just do base layer here because, and I'm not going to use super dark pressure or anything. So you're looking at the lightest color. So look at, you know, these borders of the feathers. They're fairly light. And we're just going to block in a base layer with those, going in the direction of the barbs. So think about, you know, the barbs actually, they kind of come down like this. Think about the angle that they're at. And the best way to see that angle is to look closely at what this edge looks like. And, you know, if you have the photo pulled up on a second device, you can really get a nice view of that because you can zoom it in. Which is what I like to do. I like to zoom in and out. So usually when I'm working from a photo, I'll have it up on a screen rather than printing it out. That way I can zoom in and out and I can use the magnifying tool. And again, I'm just going to smooth that out with Warm Gray 2. There's something about Warm Gray 2, and I learned this from Bonnie Snowden's tutorials. I'd highly recommend those tutorials. They're amazing. That she calls the Warm Gray 2 like a magic pencil because it works really well for smoothing out other colors. It's something to do with how the pigment interacts with the other colors. So if you look her up, it's Bonnie Snowden Fine Art. BonnySnowdon. And she does a lot of like pet portraits and horse portraits and things like that. But the techniques certainly apply to wildlife and to birds and things like that too, because she has really good suggestions for tools to use and colors to use. So the next one, let's take a look at the reference. Again, I'm going to use a pretty dark cold gray next. Cold Gray 6. So for these ones where you can see the middle of the feather, you can sketch in a line for that. And then start adding in the darker areas of the feather here. And think about, you know, when you come to this point where the back feathers come over the top of it, it's good to have your pencil really super sharp so you can maintain a suggestion of the texture there. Just like that. We won't get too carried away because I'm going to come into the black too, so I don't want too many lines there. Alright, next. And again, when you're going from this feather up into the next one, try to maintain the textury edge there. And look too at the shape of this, you know, where the wing bar part meets the darker part too. And leave just a little bit of that line there. If you accidentally cover up this lighter line, that's okay because you can go in with an eraser and kind of fix it up. But it's good to try and maintain it if you can. Yeah, there's not really a way to erase, 100% erase the darker colors of colored pencil, but you can at least mostly erase it. And, you know, if you've seen my previous classes, something I really like to use is an electric eraser. but it takes a little bit of practice to like fine tune or using it and everything. So if you want to use it, you may want to practice on like an extra piece of paper before you start using it on pieces that you're drawing. You have to be careful too, because if this end of it gets really dirty and you use it, it could create a smudge and like smudge color and pigment into your paper, which you do not want. And the other thing you can use that's a little bit easier to use is what's called a Tombow Eraser. Tombow. And that has a similar shape to the electric eraser, but it's just like a handheld eraser. It won't necessarily take as much pigment off, but it still works well. Oh, I got carried away and started doing more feathers than I said I was going to. Oh well. That's what happens when I start talking about things like that. Okay, so now we're going to use a black. So we can really, have it very sharp. And get that textury bit in there. So getting texture with colored pencils, it takes practice. And getting the angle and the texture and everything. Another thing you can do that's helpful is, zoom in on an area and try on another piece of paper just working on that area and doing it like in a bigger size. Because when you do it in a bigger size, it'll really help you to pay close attention to the details. Alright, so we'll just stop there, I can continue and add dark to those ones too, but I want to show you how to do this lighter area as well. So I'm going to start with, how about warm gray 5. So with this one here, and I'm going to go, almost to the edge with that. Like light to medium sort of pressure. And I may need to come back in with the black to get more contrast here. So that dark part ends. Do the same thing there. And the light part you can add, I'm going to sharpen my pencil a little more. Just a quick note about pencil sharpeners too. I really like pencil sharpeners that are manual because when you use electric ones, at least the ones that I've tried, it will make the end of your pencil get really, really long, so you'll wear through pencils faster. And I'm not a fan of that, so. Also, you have to be really careful if you're using Prismacolors, which are awesome pencils, because one of the few downsides of those is that they break super easily. So when you're sharpening them, just try, not to crank it too much and just be careful. Let's see, where was I? Yeah, so the edges, a little bit of fluffiness there. And think about the length of the fluffiness too. And really pay attention to your photo and try to draw what you see, not what you think is there, which can be a very difficult thing to do sometimes. But, you know, it just takes practice. And the more drawing you do, the more you'll start to see. And probably the more you'll slow down, too. Like, it takes me a lot longer to get things done than it used to now because I just add more layers. The great thing about colored pencils is that you can add so many layers, and, you know, as you add more and more layers, the detail will just sort of start appearing and just showing up. It's really neat. So try not to get discouraged, you know, if when you have the base layers down, it just looks kind of like not that great. Because as you put more and more layers on, it will magically just kind of start to come together. And everybody has their own style of doing these things and of observing things, which makes it all the more interesting. And then, should add a little, you know, when you get to these areas where it overlaps, you get sometimes kind of a darker line. But at the edges, it's still pretty light. And you'll notice if you have the reference photo out too, that there's a little bit of brown, especially in these first three feathers towards the end. So I'm gonna use a brown for that. Let's see. Probably the raw umber will be a good one for that if you have raw umber or anything that is similar. So it's kind of like a yellowish brown. And just at the ends of the feathers, you know, keep going with the texture. Add a little bit of that in, just very light pressure. And then to blend it together, let's see, what do I do with my warm gray 2? That can help to blend that brown and gray together a bit. There you go. And finally, I will just add a little bit more contrast here. So, you know, when you blend things together, if you start to notice that you have lost contrast, you can just come back in with some of your darker colors to get that contrast back. All right. So, we've done a few of those. Next, let's draw the Alula. So if you have your picture out, you'll see, your photograph out, you'll see that there's a fairly large feather right here, the Alula. So that is a pretty dark one. The edge of it, though, is kind of like a light gray. So for our base layer, we will just choose a light warm gray. Let's see. I think I'll go with the warm gray 4. And oh yes, before I do that, we need to erase the outline again until you can barely see it, of the graphite part. And this particular feather has a pretty hard line at the edge. So the other thing you can do is take a pencil like a dark sepia, which is like a neutral, sort of in between a brown and a gray, and just draw in that outline there. But the other thing we got to take into consideration too is that you have some yellow feathers coming over the top of this. So how I'm going to tackle that is if you have an electric eraser or like a thin eraser or something, that can be really useful because you can just draw this whole thing in and go over the top with the electric eraser and do just little lines over the top. The other thing that you can do is using a slice tool, which I will be honest, I still need to practice with this because it can be really tricky to learn. But I would recommend watching some other tutorials, you know, like Bonnie Snowden, for example, because she has good ones about how to use it. Basically, you're not scraping into the paper because you don't want to cut the paper. And by the way, this is not sharp. Or, you know, I should clarify. It is sharp, but it won't, like, cut you. It's not like a knife. It's a really neat tool. And you're just scraping pigment off rather than scraping into the paper. So you do need to have a few layers of color on before you try to use it. But it just kind of makes me nervous, I'll be honest. So instead of that, I've been using an electric eraser, because I'm more comfortable with it. But I'm trying to experiment with the slice tool and get better at it. Anyway, if you do not have either of those things, something like a kneaded eraser, like a putty eraser, you can get the end of it really, really sharp and erase in there. Or you can just carefully, you know, try to sketch this in and have some texture at that edge and then put your yellow in there. But I would highly recommend having some kind of tool, you know, to add light over dark, which is a tricky thing with colored pencil. Because if you're working on a bristles paper like this, you can't actually take a yellow pencil and go over the top of the gray. It just won't show up. But I'm going to show you the electric eraser method today. So I'll draw the whole feather in. Middle down here. Base layer of gray. The other thing that people use that slice tool for is white whiskers, like on dogs, that are, you know, coming over the top of like darker fur. So, you know, everything takes practice. This electric eraser takes practice too. So next I'm going to come in, it's like a brownish color actually, so I'm going to use my dark sepia. It's like a really, really dark brown. It's always good, even though you can't really see it that well in the photo, just for your own planning purposes, to draw the middle of the feather down the middle if you know it's there. Have this dark part coming out. But I'm not going quite to the edge, remember, because you've got that lighter part at the edge. And let's see. The lighter part has like a touch of brown, like raw umber in there. Okay. So now I'm going to do the electric eraser. So when you're going over something that is really dark like this, you want to make sure you have a very clean end on your electric eraser. Nice and clean. And then basically, so this will fall out when you go like that. So it is something you have to kind of learn how to hold it at the right angle so that when you're erasing, it's just erasing that pigment and not falling out. It takes some practice. But when you start it, you know, that will help to hold it in, the fact that you're pressing the button. And you know, it's got a big enough edge that that texture is not going to be perfect. So you have to come back in with the sepia, nice and sharp, and bring the texture in a bit more. But it's just helpful to erase it out because it kind of gets the texture started, if that makes sense. And then there you go. And I got a little bit of smudginess here that I need to get rid of. So that's something to be kind of careful of, especially when you're using light colors like yellow. But we can get over the top of it here with the yellow. And we'll work on the belly a bit more next class. Or actually maybe more so the class after that, because we're going to do the tail. So we'll just put in a little bit yellow. A little bit of yellow. Okay, next. We'll do the primary coverts. So that's this little group. So in songbirds, it usually looks very much like a triangle. You have these feathers kind of overlaying each other, but they've got rounded ends too. And in this particular photo, let's see, I'll count them. You really can just see barely 5. It pretty much looks like 4, and you can barely see a teeny bit of another one up here. There actually is more than that, but they're being covered up by these feathers here. So, same procedure. We're going to erase this outline of graphite so we can barely see it. Nice thing about feathers on a songbird wing is they're very nicely organized. So it's kind of like you get in the groove of doing these patterns. And this area is a lot more brownish, actually. So for my base layer and for my outlines as well, I'm going to use a very neutral type brown, which is called Nougat, at least in the polychromos. So any brown that is kind of neutral, it's not very dark, it's not very light, and it's not particularly, like yellowish or bluish or anything. Just kind of in the middle. And we're going to sketch in the outlines of these feathers. Another thing that may be helpful is re-sketch in these outlines just so you have a border there. Because you're going to, border it with brown, so that's fine to do. And I've got this little tiny one here, you can barely see. Then I have one underneath that. And again, I'm using this Barely There pencil guide to help me out. So the feathers themselves are kind of rounded, but the group together looks sort of pointed the way it's organized, if that makes sense. So I've got 3, 4, 5. There we go. And now I'm going to do the base layer with the same color. Again, thinking about, the middle of this feather is going to be here. So even though, again, you can't really see it, it may help you to sketch those in, just to help with the direction of the barbs that you're drawing. So when you do this, try not to lose that outline, have it so that you can kind of see the outline of each feather. And then, again, we'll do our smoothing with warm gray too. So again, I'm using like kind of stronger pressure for this part to blend it together, but try to remember and still be able to see where those outlines of the feathers are. Okay, so now come back in over the top of that with a little more of the nougat at the edges here. Just so we can make sure we see those edges. And finally, we're going to use dark sepia like we did for the Alula. Have it be nice and sharp. And you know, as you're going, you can sketch in the edges with the dark sepia too. But then you're doing the inner part of the feather, which is most of the feather in dark sepia, and just leaving a little bit of light at the edge. So it's kind of like, you know, the feathers are in a stack. It's almost like, I don't know, a stack of pancakes or something. It's kind of a funny analogy. It works. There we go. So I did all those because that's kind of a small feather group there. And we'll darken the edges again a little bit more. Using, let's see, I think this time we will use a little bit of burnt umber. It's light pressure. There we go. Alrighty. So now let's move on to the secondaries. So those are going to be this feather group here. So this is on like the inner part of the wing. So again, if I took out my like cartoony sketch here, these are going to be this group of feathers right here. Those are the secondaries. Primaries are out here. So the secondaries are going to be, in most birds, they're quite a bit more rounded on the ends than the primaries, which are pretty pointy. So that's a good thing to keep in mind as we're drawing these feathers. And in most birds, the three inner secondaries are going to be a little bit more prominent. Those are also known as the tertial feathers. So you'll notice if you do have your reference photo out, that those three, you know, the upper one is going to look shortest. It is shortest actually, and it's covered up a little bit by some of the back feathers, and then you have two more that are pretty obvious, and a wide area of them can be seen. So we're going to use, for the edges of these feathers, take a look at the color. I'm going to use sort of a medium kind of gray. I could go darker, but just in case I need to make adjustments, you know, it's always good to go lighter than you need to. I mean, in most cases it is. Because if you make a mistake, it won't be too hard to erase. So I'm going to use warm gray 4. Sharpen it up. And don't forget to erase that graphite on the edge of the feather group until you can barely see it. But do make sure you can still see it because you don't want to lose that edge. So you've got this first one. You know, I like to start at the top and work down, because if you notice how these feathers are overlapping, they're going to be, these ones are at the top, and then these ones are underneath of those feathers, like in a stack. Just like how we did in this primary covert group. And they do have a little bit of fluffiness to the edge, but not as much fluffiness as the coverts. Got this one here. Oh, also it's good to count them. Let's see. So really we've got about 9 that are visible here. So it's this first stack. And then this one here is pretty big. But once you get past that, the other ones underneath are pretty covered up. So you've got these lines that are very close together. Let me just re-measure this again on my bird. Okay, so we're down to about here. So those are close together. Now this is why it's good to have your pencil really sharp. So you're not crowding things quite too much. There we go. So, you know, if you need to make adjustments, I'm going to make a few small ones, that's fine. Look at the edge of that group as a whole, the group of feathers, and make sure you've got that shape, you know, fairly accurate. This one looks almost kind of like a popsicle stick shape, I guess I'd say. Rounded at the end. Okay. And then, so you'll notice the lightest color here is actually almost white. So what I'm going to do for this actually is do a base layer of warm gray 1, I think. This is the very lightest warm gray that I have. There we go. Sharpen it up. And use light pressure in the direction of the barbs. So this one here, can't really see it, but I do know that you have a middle part of the feather here. So I'll sketch that in just so you can see where it would be. Just because I can tell by the shape of it, you know, it's going to be symmetrical. So this is just basically blocking in a layer so that you have something that covers up the paper to avoid having white spots show through. And then, because this is such a light color, I'm going to go over top of it with this white luminance. Or any white pencil that you have will do. I just really like this particular one because it blends and smooths light colors really well. You do have to be careful with these luminance pencils though. You don't want to use like super hard pressure, because if you do, you may start to get shininess on the paper, especially with the dark ones. Not quite so much with the white, but if you use the black, which is also a great color, but it can get shiny if you use tons of pressure. So you don't want that, but it is a very useful pencil, you know, if you use medium pressure, because it will get a very deep black. And you may have heard some colored pencil artists, you know, they avoid using black. I do like to use it, but over the top of other colors. So what I'll do is mix something. If I want a really deep black, I will mix something like dark indigo and a darkish brown. Like walnut brown works well, or burnt umber, something like that. Mix those together, and then go over the top of it with the black. So depending on how deep the black is, I may use my polychromos black, or I may use this luminance if it's a really dark black. So like the Raven that I recently did as a commission, I used some of this really dark black for the deepest, darkest parts. Although that Raven was actually more blue than black. That was pretty interesting because of the lighting. All right. So now we're going to use, sorry, just thinking for a minute, a dark sepia for the inner part of these feathers. So this one just has a little bit of darkness. The light edge around there is actually pretty wide. And then you can bring that texture in. But don't go, you know, quite too far down, because if you're looking at the photo, you'll notice too that you have this little line of lighter brown. And something like a bistro or raw umber will work really well for that. So you're just gonna put a little bit of brown at this edge here. And always be thinking of feathers that are overlaying it to make sure you don't lose the texture at the edges. All right. So next, same thing for this guy here. But again, remember you've got this middle of this feather. And I know the picture is so dark that you can't really see the direction of the barbs. But it's good to know, you know, since this is where the feather is divided in half, basically. It's like a U shape here. It's good to know the direction, because if you get the direction different, it's going to look kind of funny. So sometimes, you know, most of the time you want to draw basically what you see, but there are certain cases where there are going to be things that just don't show up in a photo. So, for example, lots of times I get reference photos, particularly of animals, that don't, particularly of domestic animals, like dogs and cats, that don't show tons of detail. So it's good to just know a little bit about that particular type of animal to be able to, make up a little bit of the detail yourself. And sometimes I will use other photos to help me out a little bit. And again, that's also why it's really good to observe these animals when you're out. I know there's some people watching right now probably who are birders. But whether you consider yourself a birder or not, if you're interested in drawing birds and you're interested in observing birds, really, if you want to get out and see birds and you think they're cool, that honestly, in my book, makes you a birder. Because you're curious about them. You want to learn more and you want to see them. So, the more you see them flying around or coming to your feeder, or just out in your yard or in the neighborhood or wherever, the more you're going to learn about them and pay attention to the details that you see. So it will really help your drawing. I say the more you know an animal, the more it's going to show in your drawing and the more alive your drawing will look. So I'm just going to do a couple more of these. Oh, right. I'll add in this little line of brown too. Alrighty. So I've done a few secondaries. Let's just show you some of the primaries as well. Make sure that's in there nicely. Yep, I'm going to erase this outline so I can barely see it. And again, we'll start at the top because that's, how the feathers are stacked. Eraser crumbs drive me crazy sometimes. But it's good to have something like this that's like a really soft brush because you don't want to smudge it by going like this with your hand. That's a no-no. You also do have to be careful though when you're doing this because if you have little bits of pencil dust that are just kind of sitting there, it may smudge. This isn't usually much of a problem with the polychromos. And if you have a really soft brush, it shouldn't matter. But it can be a little bit more of a problem with Prismacolors. They leave a little bit more dust behind, so just be aware of that and be careful. Another thing I'll actually do sometimes is pick up the whole paper and just kind of shake it out, but you do have to be careful when you're doing that. Okay. So again, I'm going to count those feathers. So, hopefully you can see that the delineation between the secondaries and the primaries is basically, make it a little dark so you can see, where the stack of shorter feathers ends, and then you have these longer ones coming up underneath. So, you can actually see, this along here, you can count kind of the tips of the feathers that you see. I'm going to count them. 3, 4, 5, 6. So there's 6 feather tips, and then you can kind of see a 7th one that's just here at this border. Most birds have 10 primaries. So there's some that we're not seeing here. Either that or the bird may have lost a few. But they're probably just, covered up by other feathers. So we'll just sketch in the outline and then I'll draw a few of those, maybe 3 of them. Oh, by the way, I'm going to use a warm gray 4 for that. Just light pressure. You may even want to use something a little bit lighter, but I just want to make sure you guys can see what I'm doing. So really be careful here and look at the shape as you go of those feathers. So with primaries, you know, this edge that's coming out on this side is going to be, you know, kind of a little more flat, whereas this edge is going to be a little bit more round. And to help you see that, why don't I do another little funky little sketch real quick. So, you know, when you're looking at a bird wing, when it's opened, it'll basically look like, you know, this edge, actually, I mean, that's not quite right, but it's close. You know, this edge is going to be straighter, or it's going to look straighter because of the angle. And oftentimes, the barbs are going to be shorter, just because, you know, having a feather shape like that is going to help the bird to be more aerodynamic, and then longer barbs out here, so it'll be like more rounded around here. Hopefully that makes sense. Just something to keep in mind when you're drawing feathers. And you know, sometimes it might help you if you can find, basically just Google search bird anatomy and just look at a picture of songbird anatomy. Like, I know Sibley has a really good one that should come up right away when you do a Google search. And, you know, you're not copying that, you're just using it as a reference. Especially if you have a photo that doesn't show you all the details. Alright, so I've got those first three, and then when you get out here, you'll see the feathers kind of come down to more of a longer point here. Oh, and another thing, if you look really closely at your photo, you'll see that on a couple of really just like second to last feather, it kind of dips in a little right here. And that means it's something called an emarginated primary. So it's got like a little notch in here. So that's a good thing to show. And another thing sometimes I'll do is, if I'm not sure how many emarginated primaries a species has and it's hard to tell from the photo, I'll just look it up online and try to figure it out. If you're a bird bander and you have the Pile Guide to Birds, then that should tell you, which is a really useful resource. Because different kinds of birds will have different numbers of those emarginated primaries. Alright, let's double check. Awesome. And those, the emarginated primaries are going to be more obvious on something like an eagle. But I'll just show you again. Basically, it looks like this. It's got this little notch here, and then it comes down like that. Alright, so for this, again, I'm going to use a very light gray. How about, what did I use before? Warm gray 1. Good to be consistent. You know, if you know that the secondaries and the primaries have a similar kind of shade to them. Oh, and why don't we mark in just lightly where the middle part of those feathers will be. Just because it's good to keep in mind. So, you know, as I'm doing this base layer, you're going kind of in this direction out from the middle, and then down in this direction at a slight angle. And I'm doing this kind of quick, you know. I may come back in later and add a little bit more later. Then I'm going to smooth it over with my white Caran d'Ache again. Using kind of a medium pressure. Alright, so let's add a little bit of dark sepia to the middle of these too. You can see I use this color a lot. It's almost gone. But I've got another one on standby. I especially use it a lot in the Golden Eagle that I just finished, which was a lot of fun. So primary feathers, you know, they're a pretty organized group of feathers, and they really don't have much of that fluffy edging that we found on, you know, some of the upper secondaries and on the coverts. It's not, you know, completely a hard line, but it pretty much is compared to those other feathers. You can show a little texture here along the edge of the dark part, though. All right. So I think I'm going to pause there. But if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask in the comments. And basically, you know, in between now and the next class, you can definitely block in the rest of these feathers that we didn't do yet. It's going to be pretty much, you know, the same technique that we talked about. And then, oh, right, for this wing here, let me just discuss that for a moment. Because that's a little bit of a different technique. I'm going to erase, again, this graphite until you can barely see it. And then you can see, basically, it's the tertials, so the three inner secondaries. You can see this light outer part where the edges of these three feathers here are overlapping. Looks almost a bit like scales. And then underneath of that, you have a quite dark area. So that's like the shadow of this inner part of this wing. So I can take a medium sort of gray just to do a base layer. I'll just show you part of it. Like that. Then you can smooth it out with like the warm gray 1, or no, sorry, warm gray 2. Then once it looks nice and smooth, then you want to go over it with something deeper. So I would use, this is where I'd actually do my combo of brown and dark indigo, then go over the top with black. But again, just be careful because if you don't want it to look shiny, which, you know, I don't really care that much if it looks a little bit shiny. But just try not to use really intense pressure on it. Dark indigo here. And then you can take a black. So, you know, it's a pretty deep color. So I'm going to use the Caran d'Ache Black Luminance, which is almost like a pastel. You know, it's a pretty soft pencil, so it will lay down the color pretty thickly. And then you got that nice deep black there. And then, you know, for this upper part here, though, you have a lighter gray going on. So you have a similar thing to what we had going on with these three feathers. You know, you have a base layer of like a warm gray one. Then you can smooth it out with the white. And finally come in, really just looking just at the edge of that feather, so you really don't have very much dark part. But you can do a tiny bit of dark sepia up here, really just a line. And then I would take, let's see, like a warm gray 4 and just put a bit of a line in there. You can also add a little bit of like a raw umber or bistro there. All right. Oops, wrong way. So I hope that you enjoyed this lesson. I certainly had a lot of fun teaching it. If anybody has any questions, feel free to put them in the comments now, or you can also send me a message to my art page if you'd like. And I would also love to see your drawing if you would like to share it with me. So feel free to send it along as a message. I'd love that. And if you want any advice or critique or anything like that, I'd be happy to help you out with that. As well as, if you're working on another picture and have any questions about that, I'm certainly happy to help. So thank you so much for joining. Have a good rest of your day. Bye. Oh, and before I go, so I will put a link, an event link to next week. And I'm planning to do the same time next week on Saturday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Alrighty. Bye.